Hey there, everyone. This is Gregg Schutze for Draft.com, and this is the Ready for the Draft podcast, getting you ready for the NFL Draft, which is set to begin April 23rd, Las Vegas, Nevada. The backdrop will be those Bellagio fountains, the iconic Bellagio fountains, one of the most famous spots on the entire Las Vegas Strip. The Bellagio fountains will actually be where the stage is set. Rumor has it, players will be brought in by boat to the stage once their name has been called. I can't wait for this draft just to see that. Getting you ready for the draft. This week, we're going to take a look at the 115 underclassmen who have declared for the draft. 115 players, down 21 from the record-setting 136 players who entered the draft in 2018. Now, of these 115 players, 16 of them earned degrees without exhausting eligibility and opted to enter the pro ranks, and then the remaining 99 players foregone the remaining years of eligibility as underclassmen and have entered the draft. So we're going to take a look at all 115 players. I'll give you my thoughts on them, where I see them going in the draft as well. And then next week, we're going to take a look at all the postseason games. So we're going to talk about 39 bowl games, along with the national championship, which really was that exclamation point that we were all waiting for Joe Burrow. And then we'll take a look at all of the all-star games. So we're talking about the East-West Shrine Bowl, NFLPA game, Senior Bowl, Hula Bowl. We'll take a look at all of them. And now that we know everyone who's going to be entering the draft, it's time for my mock drafts. I don't like to put together a mock draft until I know exactly who's going to be in the draft, so that we can go ahead and hit the ground running, not try to make any further projections. Let's go ahead and get real. Let's get serious and get ready for the draft. So we're going to be talking about those mock drafts over the next couple of weeks, getting ready for the combine, which will be at the end of February. So a lot to get into. We're going to go ahead and take a look at some of these players. Now, what we're going to do, I'm going to go position by position. We're going to take a look at each of these guys that are coming out and just kind of talk about things from there. So the quarterback position is obviously the first one that we're going to talk about here. 5 quarterbacks have decided to enter the draft, foregoing their remaining years of eligibility. Now, Jordan Love did earn his degree at Utah State, decided to enter the draft instead of playing out his final year of eligibility there at Utah State. When you talk about the quarterback position, I think with this year's draft, obviously Joe Burrow is the odds-on favorite to be the number 1 overall pick of the Cincinnati Bengals. Beyond him, in the senior class, you have Justin Herbert. Now, Justin Herbert, he's definitely a first-round pick, but I don't know that he's necessarily going to go off the board as high as a lot of people are thinking. You know, here's one of the things. Justin Herbert, you look at the completion percentage, and I think a little bit of that is inflated because he throws a lot of screen passes, throws a lot of short passes. I think he really struggles with the intermediate game. A lot of sailed passes, and he's a tremendous athlete. Don't get me wrong, has a big arm, but I think technically, he does struggle sometimes with really those intermediate throws more than anything else. The deep balls, I think he drops the ball right into the bucket. Excellent ball placement there, but I think he's got some work to do with some of his accuracy. I liken him a little bit more to a Josh Allen type. Big athlete. And look, Josh Allen, for as much as we beat him up over the percentage and everything else, he was still a top 10 pick when it was all said and done. So I think Justin Herbert probably going to come off the board no later than 15 overall. I think Justin Herbert's still going to be there, but it does open the door for some potential underclassmen that could enter this draft. So because you look at the quarterbacks and they're really, this draft is lacking that superstar power at the senior level in those first 2 days. So a guy like Tua Tagovailoa, it makes perfect sense for him to enter the draft this year. Now, obviously Tua is dealing with that hip injury. That's no joke. You have to make sure that he's completely healthy, and all signs point to him making a full recovery. And as long as that prognosis stands up, and we've got a lot of teams that are looking at quarterbacks in the top 10. If you're the Miami Dolphins, if you're the Los Angeles Chargers, if you're the Carolina Panthers, you're taking notes. You want to find out, is that hip 100%? You're going to be taking a look and making sure that prognosis matches up, because if it does, then Tua Tagovailoa is absolutely going to be a top 10 pick, and I'd argue could very well be a top 5 pick. If I'm the Detroit Lions sitting at number 3 or the New York Giants sitting at number 4, there's a good chance that there could be a trade partner and we could trade down and get some additional assets in the draft upon doing so as well. So with Tua Tagovailoa, he has nothing else to prove at the collegiate level. National champion, Heisman runner-up. Also, there's the fear of the injury. And when you look at the injuries, it's not just the hip. He's had high ankle sprains in both ankles, had to have surgery on both, the tightrope surgery. And, it's one of those things, really, when you watch Tua play, those injuries all happen outside the confines of the pocket. He was trying to buy time. He was rolling out and really getting towards the sideline. When those two players from South Carolina fell on him, he was way outside the pocket when all of that went down. I look at Tua, I look at some of the skill set, and when you watch him throw the football, he throws his receivers open, he takes what the defense gives him, the ball placement, not only does he throw them open, but he allows his receivers to make plays after the catch. I think that's huge. He sees the entire field, he goes through his progressions, the deep ball accuracy, but the manipulation of the pocket reminds me a lot of Aaron Rodgers. He's able to make those subtle slides to his left or right, to buy time, keeping his eyes down the field as he moves to his left, steps up, avoids pressure, and delivers a strike down the field, throwing his receiver open, allowing his receiver to make a play after the catch. I think what Tua has to do, he has to make sure that he stays more within the pocket. Aaron Rodgers has made a pretty darn good living staying mostly within the pocket. You're not seeing him trying to get sideline to sideline. You're not seeing him taking off and running the football for 20 plus carries in a game either. He's staying within the pocket. I think that's what Tua can do, and Tua can be very successful. You look at him, 71.4% passer in 2019 prior to the injury, a 69.3% completion percentage for his career, over 7,400 yards passing, 87 touchdowns, just 11 interceptions. Very, very accurate, very smart with the football. I think Tua, this makes perfect sense to me. He's going to be the number 2 quarterback taken in this year's draft. So the question then becomes, who's going to be the number 3 quarterback? Is it going to be Justin Herbert? And I think a lot of people are looking at him as that potential number 3 quarterback. But I'll give you another name. Jordan Love out of Utah State, 6'4", 225-pound junior. Again, already received his degree there at Utah State. And Jordan Love, he has some work to do. He has a little bit of work cut out for him. A season ago, put up over 3,500 yards, 64% passer, 32 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, playing for Matt Wells, had, a lot of receivers, running backs, had the likes of Ronquavian Tarver, had a lot of receivers to throw to. I think, he was missing his top 4 or 5 receivers along with, a running back. So that chemistry and his tight end, don't forget Dax Raymond, also entered the draft. So he had a lot of new guys to throw to. That's one of the issues that Josh Allen ran into there at Wyoming. I look at Jordan Love and accuracy questions coming into 2019, down to just 62%, over 3,400 yards with 20 touchdowns, 17 interceptions. And I think about him, and he reminds me a lot of Daniel Jones from this perspective. Daniel Jones, I think, really, the decision making was what was questionable. Throwing some untimely interceptions, really losing sight of where he was on the football field, throwing across his body late, making some poor decisions, some poor reads, and yet it was the physical talents, so what he had between his ears and the not only those intangibles, but he had the physical skills to work with. I look at Jordan Love, and he's got the physical skill set. I think he's a smart kid. Again, already earned his degree. And I think Jordan Love has that physical skill set. He's at the Senior Bowl right now. And depending on how he does there's a chance Jordan Love could be that guy to sneak ahead of Justin Herbert, just like Daniel Jones did with the Giants. Got there at number 6. If you're a team like the Chargers, you're going to take a look at this, long and hard and say, all right, am I going with Justin Herbert, or do I take a chance and go after a guy like Jordan Love? I think that's a big question to have, especially, you have a lot of veteran quarterbacks that are going to be out there. You could take a chance on taking one of those veteran quarterbacks and then bringing in Jordan Love after a year or two, allowing him to start. Phillip Rivers, he's moved out of San Diego. Doesn't really sound like he's going to be back in Los Angeles. So it'd be the perfect time to draft a quarterback. And I think that's really going to be the thing to watch, Justin Herbert versus Jordan Love, especially at the Senior Bowl. Now, the other quarterbacks that entered the draft, you've got Jake Fromm out of Georgia, 6'2", 220 pounds, 63% completion percentage in his career, over 8,200 yards, 78 touchdowns, just 18 interceptions. For me, with him, it's the intangibles. It's what goes on between the ears, the pre-snap reads, the leadership abilities, and honestly, he had a lot of young receivers to throw to. And so you saw him really more of a game manager than anything else, really allowing the running backs, the stable of running backs that they've had since Jake Fromm has been there. Now, look, you've had guys like Justin Fields and Jacob Eason, who's also entered the draft, leave Georgia because of Jake Fromm, because of what he's been able to do. So yes, he doesn't have the physical talents that some of these other quarterbacks have. Yes, he doesn't have the big arm that some of these other quarterbacks have, but it's the intangibles. The chemistry that he started building with George Pickens at the end of the year, the freshman that really picked things up. He really made a statement in the bowl game, the blowout win over Baylor, and we'll cover that in next week's podcast. But that chemistry and his ability to make plays down the field, that's going to be something that I think we're going to have to take a long, hard look at. He's not going to wow you again with the physical talents, but I think Jake Fromm, he's going to be a day 2 pick. He's going to get into probably a more favorable position, and it's going to be interesting to see. He'll probably sit for a couple of years, but I wouldn't be surprised if Jake Fromm at some point is going to be starting in the NFL. Jacob Eason, I mentioned him already, 6'6", 227-pound junior out of Washington. Everyone remembers he was at Georgia, the freshman phenom there in 2016, 2017, he goes down to injury and really never was the same at Georgia. Jake Fromm took over, ended up transferring to Washington, moved home, and because he's from the Seattle area, 64% completion percentage, over 3,100 yards, 23 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. There's no doubt that Jacob Eason has a huge arm. He makes some throws that, very few quarterbacks, even in the NFL, are able to make. But the issue with him is he's only got one speed. Everything is a fastball. And so with that, he doesn't put enough air under the football. Everything's going to be a laser. Everything's going to be a gun. He's going to try to throw the ball as hard as he can. He's got to dial it back. He's got to dial that back, show some touch. And that's really, until Jacob Eason can develop that touch, I think he's going to be one of those quarterbacks that, there's going to be that huge question mark. He's got the big arm, but can he dial it back? That's one of the things that I talked about with Drew Lock, and I'm glad that Drew Lock, came back to Missouri and was able to work on some of that touch. I would have loved to have seen Jacob Eason go back to Washington for one more year, work on some of the touch. But look, Jacob Eason's going to be the number 5 quarterback, number 6 at the worst. He'll probably battle Jake Fromm to be the number 5 or number 6 quarterback. He'll be a day 2 pick, and again, he might go to a favorable situation. But you have to be patient with him. He's got some raw skill, some raw ability there, but I think he's going to need a little bit more development. And then there's the wild card, Cole McDonald out of Hawaii, the dreads. I think that's what everyone remembers. Wearing the dreads in honor of Hawaii quarterback Bryant Manise. 6'4", 220 pounds, over 4,100 yards passing this year, 63.8% completion percentage. Look, he has 70 touchdowns in his career, but 24 interceptions, including 14 this past season. And really a lot of those interceptions were thrown at the beginning of the season. He started off the year, very first game of the season, threw 4 interceptions, and Chevin Cordero, the freshman, ultimately had to relieve him of his duties. But since then, he's really been on a tear. And you watch him, he has the arm strength, can throw the football down the field, can throw it a mile, and really effortlessly. Very good athlete, can get outside the pocket. It's the decision making. He's very inconsistent with his decision making. What's he going to do with the football? Throws into coverage, throws late across his body over the middle. A lot of bad decisions. I think he's probably ahead of the other senior quarterbacks, though. I think in terms of ability. So there's a good chance he could end up being the number 7 quarterback when it's all said and done. I'll be curious to see how he performs at the combine and compare him with some of those senior quarterbacks. I don't know that he'll be a day 2 pick. I think we're probably looking at more of a day 3 selection, in my opinion. So when you look at last year's draft, Kyler Murray obviously went number 1 overall, Daniel Jones, Dwayne Haskins in round number 1, Drew Lock going round 2, Will Grier in round 3. So you have 5 quarterbacks going in the first 2 days. When you look at the year before that, you had the 5 quarterbacks taken in round number 1, along with Mason Rudolph taken in the 3rd. So you're talking about 5 to 6 quarterbacks. So I think Jacob Eason's probably the cutoff. After that, they're going to be, some quarterbacks are going to be battling it out from there. 11 quarterbacks taken in 2019. 2018, there were 13 quarterbacks. 2017, the year before that, just 10 quarterbacks. So I think this will be a year, a lot of teams that are looking for quarterback help. I think we're going to see that number climb. But, guys like James Morgan, I think they'll end up getting drafted late. On day 3, the Florida International quarterback. I thought he played really well in the East-West Shrine Bowl, and he's one of those quarterbacks who I think could get a shot at the next level. But that's a quarterback position. I think that's what we have stacked up. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. So we're going to move on to the running backs. Now we had 19 running backs declare for the draft. So when you put that into perspective in terms of what that means for the draft overall, we had 25 running backs drafted in all of 2019. 2018, when you're looking at the numbers, 21 running backs drafted. 2017, the year before that, well, that was the year that we ended up having 30 running backs taken. And I think you're watching, an evolution of sorts in the game with the running back position. Is it valuable? Is it not valuable? You look at the teams that are in the Super Bowl, the teams that were in the conference championship, the Titans with Derrick Henry, the 49ers with their stable of backs, Tevin Coleman, Matt Breida, and Raheem Mostert, and obviously the Green Bay Packers with Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams and Damian Williams there with Kansas City. There are a lot of running backs that, showing not only catching the football out of the backfield, but they can also run the ball between the tackles and out on the perimeter. So, I think there's a little bit of a renaissance of sorts, at the running back position, but 19 underclassmen, I think they got their work cut out for them. I think there are some good senior running backs in there as well. So let's dive into this running back class and take a look at things. Salvon Ahmed, they're at Washington, 5'11", 196 pounds. The junior went over 1,000 yards this season in just 12 games, 11 touchdowns, has 50 receptions in his career. One of those speed guys getting out on the outside, a guy who can be dynamic in space. Kind of surprised that he ended up entering the draft. I think Chris Peterson leaving probably had a lot to do with that. Obviously Myles Gaskin last year entered the draft early, got a little bit of playing time this year. So there's a chance that Salvon Ahmed can end up, making a roster because he has the athleticism. But again, just looking at the talent, he may be one of those running backs on the outside looking in when it's all said and done. Cam Akers, Florida State, 5'11", 202 pounds. The junior burst onto the scene as a freshman phenom in 2017, over 1,000 yards rushing, 7 touchdowns, 5.3 yards per carry, 16 receptions as well for another 116 yards and a score. Everyone was talking about Cam Akers as the next great running back. Then 2018 happened. Willie Taggart and company really struggled in 12 games, just 706 yards on the ground, 23 receptions though. But one of the things that I thought he really struggled with what was his vision, his field vision. I thought the cutback lanes, he just wasn't seeing those. He had cutback lanes back to the inside, and rather than doing that, he kept looking to bounce things outside. And I don't know if there was just a lack of trust in his offensive line because they did struggle. But 2018 seems to be more of an anomaly because he was really back to his 2017 self as a junior this past season. Over 1,100 yards on the ground, 5 yards per carry, 14 touchdowns, 30 receptions as well. A guy who has that nice blend of power and speed. I think he's going to be a day 2 running back. He's in that crop, right below, the top 5 running backs. We're going to talk about those top 5 backs as we get through these underclassmen. But I think Cam Akers is going to be one of those backs that teams are going to be talking about there in the 2nd to 3rd round range, and can jump on him and end up getting a really nice back out of it. Eno Benjamin, Arizona State, 5'10", and 210 pounds. The junior really had a breakout 2018 season as a sophomore, 300 carries, 1,642 yards, 16 touchdowns, 35 receptions as well. He's got 82 receptions in his career. This past season, not quite hitting the mark that he wanted to hit. Still over 1,000 yards. Played in 12 games, 10 touchdowns, have 42 receptions. Shows really soft hands. One of the things that I really like about Eno Benjamin as well is he's so difficult to bring down. Runs through contact. He has this spin move. Kind of reminds you of LaDainian Tomlinson. It's kind of hard to tackle that moving target that's spinning like that. And he does a really good job stepping out of tackles. But here's the issue for me with Eno Benjamin. It's the fumbles. And, he fumbled, really didn't have a fumble issue until his junior season. Had 6 fumbles, lost 4 of those fumbles. So in 2018, 2019, had 7 total fumbles, 4 lost, in 35 games. He's got to make sure that he can hold on to that football. Ball security is really one of those keys. That's why everyone fell in love with Kareem Hunt when he was coming out of Toledo. This was a guy who had all those touches with the Rockets and didn't cough up the football. And so that's one of the things, especially with Eno Benjamin spinning out of tackles, fighting for extra yards. He's going to have to show that he can hold on to that football to really make a difference. I think he'll end up being a late day 2, probably early day 3 guy. 4th round feels about right for him. And I think a team will get a back who, can run hard, but he can be a 3-down back because he has those soft hands. DJ Dallas out of Miami, 5'10", 214-pound junior, power back, over 1,500 yards in his career, 17 touchdowns, has 28 receptions as well, played in just 10 games. A guy who I think has battled some injuries. Again, another physical change of pace type of a back. A guy who's going to run between the tackles. Not overly shifty. I think there's some stiffness in his hips. Did finish his career with a 5.8 yards per carry. I think DJ Dallas probably has a chance to be drafted. It'll probably be late on day 3. Just because I think there are a lot of tremendous athletes that are out there, guys who can also run between the tackles that have more of a burst than DJ Dallas does. I think Derrick Henry and what he's done, this is such a copycat league. The teams are going to be looking for the next Derrick Henry, and who could that be? Well, A.J. Dillon of Boston College is 6 feet, 250 pounds. And they say he runs a 4.4 40. We'll get to see that at the Combine, end of February. I think all eyes will be on A.J. Dillon for that. He'll be in the first running back group that runs the 40, so really want to see what he can do. Now look, he burst onto the scene as a freshman, over 1,500 yards on the ground, 14 touchdowns, 5.3 yards per carry, 3 years, over 1,000 yards. Most productive year actually was as a junior, over 1,600 yards on the ground, another 14 touchdowns, just 21 receptions in his career. So not much of a guy who's going to catch the football out of the backfield, really wasn't asked to do so, didn't need to. But a guy who really battled a high ankle sprain as a sophomore. I think that's really where he kind of fell off. People weren't talking about him as much. And this season, even though he was sharing the backfield with the freshman David Bailey, still had 318 carries, 845 carries in his career with the Eagles there. So obviously there is some wear on those legs. A guy who fumbled the ball 8 times in 35 games, lost 2 of those fumbles. So another guy, if you're a big back like that, they're expecting you to run through contact. They're expecting you to fight for extra yards, but you got to hold on to the football. So ball security, another worry there. Some durability concerns as well, but definitely a guy to keep an eye out for, probably in those mid rounds for a team that's looking to try to catch lightning in a bottle and get the next Derrick Henry. Which leads us to, I think, my number 1 running back in this year's draft class, J.K. Dobbins, the 5'10", 217-pound Ohio State Buckeye, the junior. If you talk to my wife, it feels like a character from Lord of the Rings. She talks about J.K. Dobbins. Every time his name was announced, it was pretty funny. But this is a guy, 3 straight seasons, over 1,000 yards at Ohio State, the first running back to do so since Archie Griffin. Actually went over 2,000 yards as a junior, 21 touchdowns this past season, 71 receptions as well. This is a guy, I think the vision, you absolutely see that, the cutback lanes, but here's the thing. not only does he have the vision, but this year he really put everything together in terms of his patience, allowing those blocks to set up and then being able to cut off of those blocks, the acceleration. He gets to full speed in a hurry, and he has that breakaway speed that I don't think we really were expecting. I thought he was quicker than fast, the lateral agility, the jump cuts, being able to make guys miss in space, but he actually showed that he can run away from defenders, and then in the passing game, soft hands, and then he's also a really good pass protector as well. To me, J.K. Dobbins is the most complete running back in this year's draft, and for that, I think he's going to end up being the number one running back taken, and has a good chance to end up being a first round pick. Now, he's played in 42 games, 5 fumbles, 4 of those lost. So, ball security, really, if he's going to fumble the football, it's ultimately going to end, result in a turnover. And when you talk about it, you put things into perspective. That's 42 games and just 5 fumbles in those games. And when you talk about it, if you want to take it even a step further, 796 touches and just 5 fumbles. So, you do have to put some of those things into perspective, but at the end of the day, if fumbles start accumulating, you don't want to end up being the next Cleveland Gary, a guy who, was a tremendous back, but a guy who basically, fumbled his way out of the league. But I think J.K. Dobbins is a special talent, a guy who could end up being, like I said, a first round pick. Which leads me to another one of my favorite running backs. I think probably the number 5 running back in this year's draft class. That's Clyde Edwards-Helaire, 5'8", 209-pound LSU Tiger, the national champion junior, over 1,400 yards this year on just 215 carries. That's 6.6 yards per carry, 16 touchdowns, 55 receptions for over 450 yards. This is a guy to me who is just a bowling ball, just bounces off of contact. A guy who in space can make you miss, has the jump cut ability, quick acceleration, excellent vision, and then the hands. This is a guy who had 10 receptions in a game. Just a tremendous, not only a catcher of the football, he's a natural pass catcher, really soft hands, but he runs really good routes. The angle routes, his ability, a knack for finding holes in the zone. I think, Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a guy who, if teams are looking for, and I think they are, he could be the next Darren Sproles. I think I've heard comparisons to MJD, although he's not quite as big as MJD, but he's just a little bowling ball, a guy who has tremendous balance after contact. That contact balance is something that really can't be overlooked. I think he's definitely going to be a day 2 pick and a guy who can really contribute right away. Darrington Evans of Appalachian State, one of those guys I was flying under the radar, 5'11", 200 pounds, the junior back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons for the Mountaineers, 18 touchdowns this past season, 39 receptions. He's improved on the number of receptions each and every year. And look, for Darrington Evans, it's all about speed. This is a guy who can get to the outside. I love his vision, his ability to see the cutback lanes. Just really a tremendous athlete. And I really want to see what he can do at the combine. I want to see him, really show off some of those, the lateral agility, his speed, his acceleration, and I want to see him really work on those hands and really showcasing that, because I think Darrington Evans is one of those guys who can end up being a back who can contribute at the next level. He's going to be a day 3 pick. He'll probably fall to the 5th or 6th round just because of the depth of the draft class, but I wouldn't sleep on Darrington Evans. So that takes us to Pete Guerrero of Monmouth, 5'10", 190 pounds, the junior. I'll be honest, I haven't seen this kid play, but let's see, over 3,900 yards, just under 4,000 yards for his career in 34 games, 1,995 yards, that 18 touchdowns, that led FCS. Also had 69 receptions in his career. I'm going to do a little bit more studying of Pete to really get a better feel for him as a back. He's the FCS running back in this draft class. We always see one that ends up entering the draft after a tremendous season. And I think the numbers obviously are going to be eye-popping, but I think teams are going to be coming back and taking a look at some of the game film to really get a better feel for him. And really the big question too is get him to the combine, see what type of an athlete he is, but you can't sleep on that type of production. Tony Jones Jr., Notre Dame, 5'11", 224 pounds, the bruising running back, a guy who's going to pound the ball between the tackles, just under 1,500 yards in his career, 27 touchdowns. He's a guy who's earned his degree there for the Irish, decided that he wanted to go ahead and enter the draft. And, he's a pounder, a guy who's going to pound the ball between the tackles. Like I said, just under 230 pounds, really a change of pace type of guy. Not somebody who is very dynamic in the passing game, decent pass protector. But I just don't see him being a 3-down back. And so I think that's going to limit him. If he's going to get drafted, it's going to be late on day 3, could potentially be a priority free agent. Which takes us to Javon Leake out of Maryland, 6 foot, 206 pounds, junior. If you just look at the numbers, you're like, wow, just 102 carries this year, 736 yards, 8 touchdowns, just 9 receptions. This is a guy who, I like some of his game. I think he's one of those sleeper running backs. He reminds me a lot of Tony Pollard at Memphis, because Darrell Henderson got more of the talk, more of the hype with the Tigers. He got drafted early, to the Rams, and then Tony Pollard got drafted around later. And really right now, Tony Pollard is thriving in the Cowboy system, whereas Darrell Henderson's, struggling to get things going. So there is a chance that, I know that Javon Leake will probably get drafted after Anthony McFarland, but I think there's a chance that, his ceiling may be a little bit higher. Now, speaking of Anthony McFarland, 5'9", 198 pounds, the redshirt sophomore, just 2 years with the Terrapins, over 1,000 yards as a freshman. What's crazy is he only has 24 receptions in his career for a guy who can be dynamic in space. Just 1,648 yards, just 614 yards this past season in 11 games. Can be dynamic out on the outside. This was a team that was so explosive initially and then ultimately struggled down the stretch, really putting anything together. Offensive line issues as well. Both he and Javon Leake squat 450 pounds, that lower body strength. They run through contact, just 198 pounds at 5'9", low center of gravity, but really able to run through that contact. He's one of those guys. It'll be interesting. I think they'll both end up being day 3 picks. I think McFarland will probably get drafted first, but again, don't sleep on Javon Leake. Deshaun McClease, Virginia Tech, 5'9", 190 pounds. Over 1,800 yards in his career there for the Hokies, 12 touchdowns, 28 receptions. This is a guy, to me, never really eye-popping numbers, just 4.7 yards per carry. But a guy who, again, another guy with a low center of gravity, good balance, runs through some contact as well. I think he's one of those guys who's really going to have to shine to really step things up. So that's really going to be one of the big questions for him. I'm not really sure if Deshaun McClease, is going to be drafted. I think he'll probably end up being a priority free agent. Again, with the talent in this year's draft class, he's one of those guys who I think is going to fall through the cracks. Which takes us to DeAndre Swift, 5'9", 215 pounds, the junior out of Georgia. There's no worries about him getting drafted. I think he'll be drafted early. He has a chance to be a first rounder. I think he's one of the more polished backs in this year's draft. Back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons, 73 receptions in his career as well. He's one of those guys. There's not a whole lot of wear on his legs. He in his 3 years with the Bulldogs, never had more than 200 carries in any given season. Sharing the backfield with Nick Chubb and Elijah Holyfield. And, this past season with Brian Herrien and Zamir White and James Cook, didn't really have to worry about a lot of that wear. And that really impacts some of the numbers. And the fact that he was sharing in the backfield and still back-to-back 1,000-yard season, 6.6 yards per carry in his career as well. Dynamic in space. The quick acceleration, I think the vision, when he's in the open field, he's a special back, has the speed to go the distance, and soft hands in the receiving game. I think that's one of the things that definitely jumps out on the tape for you as well. I think, DeAndre Swift right now, to me, I've got him penciled in as my number 2 running back behind J.K. Dobbins, at least for the moment. J.J. Taylor out of Arizona, 5'6", 185 pounds. The junior, the diminutive one. And, he's one of those guys who, has battled some injuries. Over 1,400 yards as a sophomore in 2018. This past season, just 721 yards, really an offense that struggled to get things going, has 62 receptions in his career. He's going to have to showcase his versatility. He's just 5'6", but here's the thing. Guys like Tariq Cohen have shown that these smaller backs still have a home at the next level. They still have some value, but he's going to have to showcase that he can be a pass catcher, that he can be one of those dynamic weapons. Tariq Cohen has been able to pay off in a big way for the Bears. I just don't know, again, J.J. Taylor, is he going to be able to outshine some of these guys in this running back class? I don't know right now if that's going to happen. Jonathan Taylor out of Wisconsin, 5'11", 219 pounds. Look, the junior, I think he was sixth in the Heisman voting in 2019, two-time Doak Walker Award finalist, over 6,000 yards on the ground, 6,174 to be exact. Fell just 23 yards shy of having 3 consecutive 2,000-yard seasons. Only he and Troy Davis of Iowa State back in the 90s ran for 2,000 yards in back-to-back seasons. 50 touchdowns in his career. Now, look, he only had 16 receptions coming into the season. You wanted to see, can he catch the ball out of the backfield? And, he's improved. I think he still has a long way to go. 26 receptions, but you saw a lot of drops, especially, if you were watching the Rose Bowl, had a couple of drops there, some easy drops, should have been able to hold on to the football. And then, my biggest concern for Jonathan Taylor is ball security. 18 fumbles, 15 lost. In 41 games, and you look at it, he was a workhorse. I think that's the other thing. Some of the wear on his legs, 968 touches total in his career. That's going to be a concern, but the ball security is the bigger concern for me. You watch the Rose Bowl, you watch him fighting for extra yards, and Troy Dye ripped the ball out of there like it was nothing. Like it was so easy for him to pull the ball free. That's a huge concern. It should not be that easy to pull the football away from a guy who could potentially be a first-round pick. That's really concerning. That said, Jonathan Taylor has that perfect blend of power and speed. The acceleration, he gets to full speed in a couple of steps. We said that about J.K. Dobbins. He's been my number one running back for a while, but the more I think about it, there are those concerns that some of the other running backs just don't have at this point. But man, he's a 10-400-meter guy. The long speed, I think he's got some of the agility as well between the tackles, the vision. And look, with Wisconsin and their blocking scheme, it allows him to really be patient, to set up his blocks. He's one of the more patient running backs in this year's draft class. I still think he's going to be a day 2 guy, but I think there are some concerns that are going to keep him from being drafted in round number 1. Michael Warren, the second out of Cincinnati, 5'11", 222 pounds. They call him the truck. And there's a reason for that. If you watched last year's game against UCLA, he got into the goal line and the Bruins just could not stop him. It was, Bearcats ended up upending the Bruins in that game. And, he went on his way to, rush for over 1,300 yards, back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons, 1,265 yards this past season, 34 touchdowns in his career, 51 receptions as well. He's a bruiser, man. He's going to pound the ball between the tackles, has a little bit of a burst, but he's not going to run away from you. But he's one of those guys who just wears defenses down, gets better as the game goes along. He's not as tall as Derrick Henry, but he's one of those guys, just like Derrick Henry, he's going to wear you down. He's going to just continue to pound the ball and pound the ball and pound the ball until you're going to, give in. In 38 games, just 3 fumbles, and those were all in 2018. Did not fumble once in 2019 on 282 total touches. So for me, I look at Michael Warren. He's a top 10 running back for me. I think he'll probably end up getting drafted probably in the 4th, 5th round range, but a guy who I think can end up making an NFL roster and, can end up getting some playing time early on. Tyson Williams, 6 foot, 220 pounds there for BYU. This is a guy who had a year of eligibility. He started his career with the Tar Heels, moved to South Carolina and the Gamecocks, finished his career out with BYU, and a guy who's just battled injuries. 3 out of his 4 seasons playing at the FBS level, and this past season just 4 games played before he went down to a knee injury. He's one of those guys. He was very exciting. He was one of those he looked like playing for BYU. He finally had things going, running with some power, showed some acceleration on the outside, and then the injury bug hit him again. He's one of those guys, just from a durability concern, I think that's a huge red flag. And then Torrin Young out of Iowa, 5'11", 223 pounds. He was the bruiser of the running backs that you had there. Tyler Goodson was a guy who had tremendous speed. You had Mekhi Sargent, and then there was Torrin Young. Just 1,200 yards on the ground, 8 touchdowns in his career, just 9 receptions. If teams are looking for a guy who's going to run the ball hard between the tackles, he could potentially convert to a fullback. If teams are looking for guys who can be a lead blocker, that could potentially be Torrin Young. But I think that's probably the extent of what teams are going to expect him to do at the next level. I don't see him being a draftable prospect at this point. Which leads us to the wide receiver position. And I'll tell you what, this wide receiver class can be special. And it's one of those things, you look at the depth, there's just so much depth at every level of this draft class. It reminds you of that 2014 draft class, Sammy Watkins, Mike Evans, Odell Beckham Jr., Brandon Cooks, Kelvin Benjamin, all taken in round number 1, Marquise Lee, Jordan Matthews, Paul Richardson, Devontae Adams. Gosh, he was taken with the 21st overall pick in the second round. Wow. Jarvis Landry taken towards the end of round number 2. Just so many wide receivers in that draft class, and it was really heavy at the top with a lot of those receivers. And, we'll get into some of the talent that's coming out and entering the draft. Man, it's going to be a lot of fun. We had 28 receivers taken in last year's draft. Obviously, Marquise Brown, Deebo Samuel, A.J. Brown, Mecole Hardman, all playing. Obviously, DK Metcalf. Gosh, DK Metcalf fell to number 64 overall. You had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 receivers taken before DK Metcalf, and he's been a beast for Seattle. 2 more receivers taken in before Terry McLaurin came off the board. So 28 receivers taken. If you look at 2018, you had 33 receivers taken. Let's see, 2017, the year before that, 32. Now you talk about the 2014 draft class. How many receivers were taken there? Well, you had 33 receivers taken, and then after a draft class like that, you had another 35. So just giving you an idea there, what some of those numbers are going to look like as we enter the 2020 draft. You had 22 receivers entering the draft, and that's not including some of these special senior receivers, the Michael Pittmans, the James Prochet's, the KJ Hill, who's played really well so far at the Senior Bowl. There are going to be a lot of Colin Johnson, Devin Duvernay, a lot of names, Tyler Johnson, that we're going to be talking about. So we jump into this draft class, and you look at Lynn Bowden Jr., 6'1", 199 pounds, out of Kentucky. The junior, man, this was a kid, just 1,300 yards receiving in his career. But what makes him so special was his versatility. This is a guy who can, dabbled in kick returns, both kick and punt returns, had 2 punts returned for touchdown his sophomore season. But this past season, you had all the injuries to the quarterback position, ends up stepping in, taking on the quarterback role, just completed 47% of his passes. But, he rushed for over 1,400 yards, 13 touchdowns, and had 30 receptions before he took over at the quarterback position. His versatility, his explosiveness, I think those are things that, teams are going to look at. I think when you look at the success of Lamar Jackson, you look at the success of Taysom Hill, teams are going to be looking for guys who can do a little bit of everything, who can catch teams off guard. And I think Lynn Bowden can be that type of player. I think with this draft class, he could be a late day 2 pick, early day 3 pick. Could be one of those developmental guys that comes off the board in round number 4. Quintez Cephas out of Wisconsin. Now, this was a kid who was kicked off the team and expelled. He had the issues with sexual assault charge, and ultimately those charges were dropped. He was found innocent of those charges. He was reinstated at the school and also reinstated to the football team. A kid who was really fighting to get back out on the football field, and ultimately was exonerated, and had a tremendous year. 59 catches, 901 yards, 7 touchdowns. And look, he wasn't really asked to be that dynamic receiver all that often, because you had Jonathan Taylor running the ball between the tackles, Jack Conan developing quarterback. But I'll tell you what, he was the one receiver that really was explosive on the outside. And there wasn't a corner that Wisconsin went up against that could really cover him vertically. He's has decent size, and I think what he does is he wins at the line of scrimmage. He fights through the jam really well, uses his hands to get off of that, and gets vertical. And once he has a step or two on you, he does a really good job tracking the ball in the air. Excellent hands. Quintez Cephas is going to be one of those sneaky receivers that people aren't talking about because of the depth of this receiver class. He's one of those guys that you'd love to say, yeah, he's going to come off the board in round number 3. He'll probably be an early day 3 pick, but I think teams will be really happy with Quintez Cephas. Isaiah Coulter out of Rhode Island. Now, if you haven't already noticed, we're going alphabetically. So, some of these guys, as we're looking at it, they're not the household names. We're going alphabetically. Isaiah Coulter out of Rhode Island, 6'3", 190 pounds. The junior, over 1,000 yards this past season, 72 catches. 14.4 yards per reception, 8 touchdowns. He's going to be one of those guys who he's going to have to rely on his individual workout and really show that he can stand out if he's going to want to be drafted. Gabriel Davis, UCF. Here's an intriguing prospect. He's 6'3", 212 pounds. The junior set the UCF record with over 1,241 yards and 12 touchdowns at 17.2 yards per reception. An absolute beast down the field, wins those 50-50 balls. Really good athleticism. And, he attacks the ball at its highest point. Just very, very strong hands at the catch point. And, someone, like I said, he can get vertical. And I look at him as a potential second-round pick. I look at him, he reminds me a lot of Michael Pittman Jr. They do a lot of the same things. They can get vertical on you. I think they'll both end up being possession receivers, guys who excel at the back shoulder, throw the 50-50 balls. But Gabriel Davis, I would have loved to have seen him come back to UCF for one more year, play with Dylan Gabriel, and potentially be one of those top 2 or 3 receivers in next year's draft. But that said, I still think he'll be a second rounder when it's all said and done. Kyle Davis, Florida Atlantic, 6'2", 219 pounds. The junior kicked off Auburn for violating team rules. Went to FAU. They signed him in 2018. Entered the transfer portal. He's now in the draft. Just 19 catches in his career. I think he's going to look to try to get a workout in with one of the teams. I just don't see him being a draft eligible prospect. Is he going to be a free agent signed with the team? They may bring him in, and at least get a look. Courtney Davis, another receiver who, another underclassman who got his degree there at Texas A&M, decided to enter the draft. 6'2", 200 pounds, really good route runner. I think that's one of the things that I think of with Courtney Davis. Not a guy who really stands out. 99 receptions in his career, just 1,201 yards, 11 touchdowns. Got a little bit of a burst to him. I think he sinks his hips pretty well in and out of his breaks. I think that's really the suddenness with his breaks is kind of what stands out to me. I think he'll probably end up being a late day 3 pick though. KJ Hamler, Penn State, 5'9", 176 pounds, redshirt sophomore. I think this dude is going to blow things up in the slot. He's proven at Penn State that he can be a vertical threat on the outside, but man, you put him in the slot and let him just do his thing. I think he's very explosive. He's on the small side, so he's one of those guys who can get rerouted. That's why he's going to really have to work off of press coverage, show that he can win at the line of scrimmage. But man, 16.1 yards per reception, 8 touchdowns. A guy who can just get vertical on you. He's somebody who I think is going to be a second round pick. And because of that explosiveness, I really want to see what he runs at the combine. I think because of that, he can end up moving his name above some of these other guys when it's all said and done. T. Higgins, Clemson, 6'4", 215 pounds, the junior, went over 1,000 yards this year, 1,167 yards, 13 touchdowns, 19.8 yards per reception, a downfield threat, a guy who, again, wins those 50-50 balls, not afraid to go over the middle, excellent catch radius, a flair for the acrobatic as well. But man, he struggles to separate. I think in the national title game going up against LSU, obviously those LSU corners, Christian Fulton and Derek Stingley really played with a lot of outside leverage. And it was one of those things where Higgins just, early on got that play up the seam. Thought he was going to have a huge game. Ultimately finished the game with just 2 receptions, struggled to separate, and that's really going to be the big knock for him. Is he going to, I think he'll be a possession guy, and I think some of these more explosive receivers are probably going to move up the board ahead of him. Still think he'll probably end up being a first-round pick. I just don't think he's going to go as high as some. I'm not as high on T. Higgins as some other people are. Isaiah Hodgins, a 6'4", 209-pound receiver out of Oregon State, the junior with the Beavers, over 1,000 yards receiving, 86 catches, 1,171 yards, 13 touchdowns, was Jake Luton's favorite target. He's a big kid, and one of those guys who I think struggles at times to get in and out of his breaks. I think he has a tremendous catch radius, though, a guy who can be a weapon over the middle, down the field, in the red zone. So I think Isaiah Hodgins is going to be a day 3 guy, but I think he'll get drafted. Tristan Jackson out of Syracuse, 6'1", 191 pounds. Another guy who can get vertical on you. Started his career at Michigan State before transferring to Syracuse prior to the 2018 season. Went over 1,000 yards this year at Syracuse. And 11 touchdowns, catching the passes from Tommy DeVito was his number 1 target. And he's one of those guys, I think he can be a dynamic receiver. Would have loved to have seen him come back for one more year. He's been only played in 11 games before finishing the year this past season, playing in a full 12 games. So I think that has a lot to do with him coming out. But I just worry that he's one of those guys who's going to get, just fall through the cracks. He'll probably end up being a priority free agent. I just don't know that he's going to get drafted. He's really going to have to step up and showcase his skills. If he gets an invite to the combine or, in his workouts, his individual workouts. Justin Jefferson, man, smooth operator, 6'3", 192 pounds, LSU, over 100 receptions this past year, 111 receptions, 1,540 yards, 18 touchdowns. And Justin Jefferson, look, Jamar Chase was the Biletnikoff Award winner and really was a standout of the national championship game. But Justin Jefferson was a model of consistency, a guy who isn't afraid to go over the middle, a guy who attacks the seam really well, a guy who wins at the point of attack. At the line of scrimmage, excellent hands, tremendous catch radius, a guy who does a really good job setting up his man, really good route runner, a guy who's going to, the sluggos, the post corners. You see a lot of these routes from Justin Jefferson, and I think that ability, that route running ability, I've got him slated ahead of T. Higgins, and frankly, I think he's also going to go ahead of Laviska Shenault, who we'll talk about here in a little bit. I think Justin Jefferson's going to be a surefire first rounder when it's all said and done. Jerry Jeudy out of Alabama, 6'1", 192 pounds, the junior, 2018 Biletnikoff Award winner, going over 1,300 yards that season, 14 touchdowns. This year, 77 receptions, 1,163 yards, 10 touchdowns. I think he's the most explosive in and out of his breaks. I think he can be a vertical threat as well. The suddenness in and out of his breaks, I think, is what's really special with him. I don't have him as high as CeeDee Lamb. I don't like some of the easy drops, a lack of concentration, some balls that really just fell right through his hands, just hit him right in his hands. If I'm going to take a receiver in the top 5, top 10, you got to be able to hang on to the football. And I thought that was one of the more disappointing things out of Jerry Jeudy this past season. But look, he's not getting out of the top 15. If nothing else, the Raiders will take him there in round number 1. They're looking for a number 1 receiver. So I think his stock is going to be just fine. CeeDee Lamb, just mentioned him, 6'2", 189 pounds out of Oklahoma, back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons. This past season, Biletnikoff Award finalist, was caught passes from Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray, and Jalen Hurts, 2 Heisman Trophy winners and a Heisman runner-up. That's pretty incredible. And this past season, look, 21.4 yards per reception, 14 touchdowns, and he's one of those guys, another smooth operator, a guy who has a tremendous catch radius, not afraid to go up and catch the football. But what I really love is his ability to run after the catch. The physicality with which he plays. When you watch him play, he reminds me a lot of Julio Jones after the catch. Obviously, he's a little bit slighter at 189 pounds. And he's also not going to run 4.39 in the 40, but he was one of those guys, the balance after the contact, very physical, throwing guys off. If you watch that Texas game, that's really all you needed to watch out of him. He's an explosive receiver on the outside, goes up and wins those 50-50 balls, has a flair for the acrobatic, can make those athletic catches. A lot of people have him slated going to Arizona as a top 10 pick to be the number one target for Kyler Murray, replacing Larry Fitzgerald, who's already said he's coming back for one more year. I really think they need an offensive lineman in round number 1 to protect Kyler Murray, and then go get your receiver. CeeDee Lamb, probably going to be a guy that the Raiders are going to be keeping an eye on. But I think, to me, he's my number 1 wideout. I think he's one of those guys. People slept on Nuke Hopkins. He ran in the 4.5 range. Michael Thomas also ran in the 4.5 range. He fell to the second round. And I look at CeeDee Lamb. He can be physical. He can be very physical, much like Michael Thomas can be really physical down the field. And I see CeeDee Lamb. I see those guys in his play. Donovan Peoples-Jones, 6'2", 208. Out of Michigan. Look, the quarterback play there at Michigan hasn't always been the best. I think Shea Patterson proving at the Senior Bowl he's not really a draftable prospect at this point. But DPJ, the athleticism, he's very athletic after the catch. Returned a punt for a touchdown in his career. I'm sorry, that was actually Jalen Reagor. I apologize, but he is a dynamic receiver with the ball in his hands. A guy who works underneath routes very well. A guy who also works the sidelines. Some people have him as a borderline first, second rounder. I actually think he may end up coming off the board in round number 3, but a guy who I think could end up being the number 2 or number 3 receiver for a team. Which leads us to Jalen Reagor, who, yes, he returned a kick for a touchdown, but you look at Jalen Reagor and his year was 2018, 72 receptions, over 1,000 yards, 9 touchdowns in his sophomore season. This past season, had a freshman, Max Duggan, throwing the football to him. Really struggled to develop some of that chemistry, some of that rapport, but he's absolutely explosive on the outside. Really, you got to watch that 2018 tape to really get a good feel for who Jalen Reagor is. Explosive, dynamic in space, makes people miss, but don't ever ask him to catch the ball in traffic. He's one of those guys, I think, when he gets rerouted easily. He's one of those slight guys. He's probably going to be working best out of the slot. But he's one of those guys I worry about him with those contested passes. Kendrick Rogers, Texas A&M, 6'4", 204 pounds, the junior. I think he was known for some of these big catches. Yeah, and some of the big plays, that Texas A&M game, that 7 overtime game. I think people remember his catch in the end zone. But look, he's only played in 23 games in 3 seasons there for the Aggies, and just 786 yards, receiving 7 touchdowns. The medicals, you're going to have to take a look at that. But look, the kid has a huge catch radius. He's one of those guys that teams are going to keep an eye on. And he's got the frame, potentially could put some size on, be another Darren Waller type. I've been saying Chase Claypool, Juwan Johnson. Those are guys who I think need to put on a little bit of weight. And you could be the next Darren Waller. You may only be a 3rd or 4th receiver on a team, but you could potentially be a Pro Bowl tight end when it's all said and done. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there with Kendrick Rogers. Henry Ruggs III out of Alabama, 6 foot, 190 pounds, the junior, 98 receptions in his career for Bama, 1,700 yards, 24 touchdowns. Can't really use that as a huge gauge, though. Obviously, when he's sharing receiving core, trying to spread the ball around to Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith, and Jalen Waddle. But Henry Ruggs is special when it comes to his vertical game. Speed demon, a guy who's going to challenge for the 40 record at the Combine. He's one of those vertical threats. Obviously, you see the success that Marquise Brown had right away with the Ravens, and I think teams are going to be looking at Henry Ruggs the same way. I think he's a little bit more polished route runner than Marquise Brown is. That's one of the things that Marquise Brown was continuing to work on there at OU when he came out, and so I think he's a little bit further along. I think right now I've got him as my number 3 wideout, but a guy, again, he can get vertical, and teams are going to like that, and it's one of those things to where it wouldn't be surprising if he runs a really fast 40 time, that he could potentially sneak ahead of CeeDee Lamb and Jerry Jeudy because of that vertical speed. We'll see. Laviska Shenault, 6'2", 220 pounds, the junior out of Colorado. In just 9 games, 86 receptions, over 1,000 yards, and 6 touchdowns. Also had 17 carries, 5 touchdowns for the Buffaloes in 2018. In 11 games this past season, just 56 receptions for 764 yards. Guy who was limited with his route tree, ran a lot of underneath routes, and really had to make a lot of things happen after the catch. Ran a lot of drag routes, slants, crosses, and really had to do a lot after the catch. Very physical receiver, a guy who can be very explosive. If you watch that USC Colorado game, it was Shenault versus Pittman Jr., and those guys were just going at it left and right. And you really had to know where Shenault was on the field at all given times. He got a ball and took the handoff against SC and was gone. Just that speed that could take the top off of a defense. He's a threat to go at any given time, but that route tree is going to have to improve some of the route running ability, and then it's the durability. Look, he's missed a ton of games. He's played 27 games in 3 seasons, and he's battled injuries. He's tough, and he's tried to play through the injuries, but it's one of those things to where he struggled to stay healthy. And that's my biggest concern is if I'm going to take a receiver in round number 1, I got to make sure I can keep him on the football field. Much like Tua Tagovailoa, those medicals are going to be critical. And if they can show that this is not a guy, I can keep him on the field, I can have him be a go-to guy for my quarterback, then I think Laviska Shenault easily will be a first-round pick. Jeff Thomas of Miami, 5'10", 174 pounds, the junior speed demon for the Hurricanes. Just played in 10 games this past year. Miami's really struggled at the quarterback position in recent years, and I think it's really showed with production for some of the receivers or lack thereof. Really a vertical threat, a guy who's going to get down the field. He's going to struggle to get drafted, though, just because there's just the lack of production. A lot of guys that do a lot of the same things he does. So I'm really not sure what's going to happen there for Jeff Thomas. He's really going to have to show up well in his workouts. Quez Watkins of Southern Miss, 6'2", 190 pounds, junior. 64 receptions, just under 1,200 yards, 6 touchdowns this past season, 18.4 yards per reception, has a large catch radius. Another guy who's going to make plays down the football field. I think he'll be a day 3 guy. I think he'll have a shot. He'll probably be the number 4, number 5 receiver on a team, but a guy who I think has some skills that can be offered at the next level. Cody White, 6'3", 215 yards, Michigan State. Had his biggest year this past season, 66 catches, 922 yards, 6 touchdowns. The thing that I worry about with Cody White is he's a big-bodied receiver, a guy who does a really good job shielding defenders from the football, good red zone option as well, but can he separate? Man, he struggled to get off Damon Arnett against Ohio State, and that's really one of the things that you have to worry about there with Cody White. If he can't show that he can separate, and that's really what teams are going to be looking at as they go to the game film, he's going to be he may or may not get drafted late on day 3. And then the last receiver, Darnell Solomon, out of South Florida, 6'3", 207. Last played in 2018. Had 25 receptions for 440 yards for the USF Bulls. Dismissed by Charlie Strong prior to the bowl game. Ended up entering the transfer portal. Never got picked up. He'll be eligible as well. Which takes us to the tight ends. We have 8 tight ends that are draft eligible this season. And when you talk about the tight end position in this year's draft, I think it's one of those that was really underwhelming. And I think some of this talent here at the tight end position has really, infused some more excitement into the position. Some much needed talent coming in. 16 tight ends taken in 2019. TJ Hawkinson, Noah Fant taken in round number 1, Irv Smith Jr., Drew Sample in round number 2, and then there were 4 tight ends taken in round 3: Josh Oliver, Jay Sternberger, Kahale Waring, and Dawson Knox. Foster Moreau looks to be a steal for Oakland there in round number 4. So you have some tight ends that were out there that ultimately not only made roster, but are making some plays. 2018, you had 15 tight ends taken. 2017, another 14. Again, 8 tight ends coming out into this draft as underclassmen. And I think there are some guys, when it's all said and done, that we're going to be seeing come off the board in the first 4 or 5 rounds. Devin Asiasi out of UCLA, 6'3", 279 pounds. The junior started his career at Michigan, transferred to UCLA, sat out the 2017 season. Really, only played in 4 games for the Bruins in 2018. This past season, 12 receptions. I'm sorry, in 12 games, 44 receptions, 641 yards, 4 touchdowns. Showed that he can be a weapon down the seam. Some surprising speed for a guy his size. I was really impressed with him taking off and getting vertical down the field. Wasn't really expecting to see that. So he's one of those guys. I'm kind of surprised that he came out, but that's one of the things. Chip Kelly, that offense, they struggled at times, and so I look at Devin Asiasi. Is he going to be a guy? I think he'll get drafted on day 3. But I think it'll probably be 5th roundish when we see Devin Asiasi come off the board. He's a really good blocker, though, and a guy who can make some catches down the field. Might be a better pro than a college player. Hunter Bryant, 6'2", 239 out of Washington. Look, the junior, 52 receptions, 825 yards, 3 touchdowns. Numbers that are rival another guy who was a little undersized, a bigger receiver type, and that was Evan Ingram out of Ole Miss. Now, Evan Ingram ran a silly 4.6 40 at the tight end position. Or I think it was actually a 4.5. And ultimately got drafted in round number 1. I think Hunter Bryant, he'll be a day 2 pick, but a guy who, again, he's dynamic with the ball in his hands. He lines up all over the field. He's going to be a receiving tight end. He's not going to be much of a blocker, but that's one of the things that Evan Ingram has continued to work on there for the Giants. But I see Hunter Bryant as one of those guys. If teams are looking for receiving tight ends, and you see guys like Darren Waller and Mark Andrews have success, so I think you're going to see him drafted earlier on in the draft. Dalton Keene out of Virginia Tech, 6'4", 251. The junior, 748 yards in his career, 8 touchdowns. But I look at him as a blocker. I think he's more of that blocking tight end. I want to see what type of athlete he is at the combine, but I look at him as an H-back, one of those guys. Could be a second or third tight end, really be more of those blockers. Could probably put him in as a fullback and be a lead blocker as well. He'll probably be a priority free agent, possibly get drafted late in round 3. Cole Kmet, I look at him as possibly the number 1 tight end right now. I think he does a little bit of everything. He's a receiver on the outside, show that he can separate from guys a little bit, be a matchup nightmare in the red zone, a guy who works the middle of the field really well, up the seam, runs away from linebackers, bigger than a lot of the safeties, 6'5", 250 pounds, good inline blocker as well. If anything, it's the injuries. He's played in just 23 games in his career. This past season, though, 43 receptions, 515 yards, 6 touchdowns. He's a dynamic athlete. Really, the medicals, that's the biggest thing that you worry about. Is he going to be able to stay healthy throughout his NFL career? Can his body withstand the rigors of a 16-game season? That's going to be the biggest concern, but I think he has the skill set that's going to warrant ultimately a second-round grade when it's all said and done. Kyle Markway out of South Carolina, 6'4", 250 pounds. Didn't really know a whole lot about this kid. Didn't really play a whole lot until 2019. 31 catches, 349 yards, couple of touchdowns. I need to go back and study some more film on Kyle Markway to get a better idea for him. There's just a lot of talent in this year's draft. I see him possibly being a late pick, potentially a priority free agent as well. Which leads us to Randy Moss's son, Thaddeus Moss, 6'3", 249 pounds, the junior out of LSU, really made a name for himself in the college football playoff. both against Oklahoma and against Clemson. 47 receptions, 570 yards, 4 touchdowns in his only season at LSU. Transferred from North Carolina State. When you look at Thaddeus Moss, another guy jumps off the athleticism. You saw some of the body control, made a ridiculous catch on the sideline. Just extending for the football. I want to say it was in the SEC championship game where he just extended for the football out, feet in bounds and just extended out. The ball was thrown to the outside, out of bounds, really almost getting full extension, almost parallel to the ground when he made the catch. Really a dynamic pass catcher, really, that runs in the family there. And, I think he's going to be, he could be tight end 1, tight end 2. I don't think he's going to be a first rounder, but he'll be a second round pick. And he'll be one of those pass catchers that'll end up being a quarterback's best friend. Albert Okwuegbunam, 6'5", 255 pounds there at Missouri. I think he's going to be one of the faster tight ends in this year's draft. Really going to be curious to see what he can do. Each of his seasons there with the Tigers struggled with some injuries, played in 9 games in each of his 3 years. Over 1,000 yards receiving in his career, 98 catches, 23 touchdowns. Really set the world on fire as a freshman with 11 touchdowns and then 12 touchdowns in the final 2 seasons there at Mizzou. Missouri puts out some tight ends. We've seen, the likes of Chase Kaufman or Martin Rucker. And I think Albert is one of the more athletic tight ends to come out of Missouri. I look at Okwuegbunam right now, Albert O. He still needs to improve as a blocker. I think, the durability, has to be a concern as well. I think he'll run really well at the combine. But I think Albert O probably going to end up being a 4th round pick when it's all said and done, just because, he still has to develop as a blocker, but can be a dynamic pass catcher on the outside. Really was a big target of Drew Lock's. And when he lost Albert O, Drew Lock really struggled to find any chemistry with any of his other receivers. Colby Parkinson, Stanford, 6'7", 251 pounds. Look, you know what you're getting when you get a Stanford tight end, a guy who can catch the football down the field, especially up the seam, can be a red zone option and knows how to block. Austin Hooper, Levine Toilolo. I look at Colby Parkinson. He has a little bit of the route running ability of Austin Hooper, has the size of Levine Toilolo, so it kind of falls in between there. A guy who's probably going to be a 5th round pick when it's all said and done. 48 grabs, 589 yards, just 1 touchdown this year. 1 year removed from having a 16.7 yard per catch average and 7 touchdowns for the Stanford Cardinal. A big reason for that, KJ Costello was healthy, dealing with Davis Mills and the quarterback situation there for the Stanford Cardinal. KJ Costello is opting, to enter the transfer portal. So, now was the time for Colby Parkinson to enter the draft. He's one of those tight ends I think is going to be a middle round guy and a guy who's going to stick around. Look, Levine Toilolo, carved out a nice path for him as a number 2, number 3 tight end. I think Colby Parkinson has more athleticism than Toilolo, and I think he's one of those guys who can end up playing for a long time. The offensive tackle position. So we have 8 offensive tackles that declared this past season, and when you're talking about the offensive tackle position at the next level, we had 23 drafted this last season. Jonah Williams, Andre Dillard, Titus Howard, Caleb McGarry, all taken in round number 1. Cody Ford taken in round 2, Max Sharping, out of Northern Illinois, the technician, not the greatest athlete, but a technician, drafted in round 2. Trey Pipkins looks like he's going to end up being the left tackle of the future for the Chargers. He was taken in round number 3. Chuma Edoga got some playing time for the Jets. Bobby Evans looks like he's going to be a future starter there for the Rams at tackle, as is David Edwards, who's taken in round 5. So there's some guys. Justin School for the Niners, taken in round number 6. So there's some guys that have gotten some playing time. Like I said, 23 tackles taken in this last draft, just 19 in 2018. 13 in 2017. Teams are looking for tackles, and that's one of the things that I think with this draft class, you look at these eight tackles, and I think they can all come off the board in the first 3 days, the first 3 rounds of the draft. Mekhi Becton, Mount Becton, 6'7", 368 pounds, the junior, When I first saw him play, I wondered if he was going to have the foot speed. Is he going to be a guy that's going to play at guard? And I initially had him penciled in as a guard in my top 10. This guy absolutely moves so much better than I thought. You watch him play, the athleticism, his ability to get to the second level, the kick slide is effortless. A lot of guys, Daniel Jeremiah, Dane Brugler have compared him to Bryant McKinney, and I think that's fair, a fair comparison there. Daniel Jeremiah actually has him coming off the board, number 4 overall to the Giants. I ultimately think when I have my first draft, my first mock draft, I'm going to have Jedrick Wills going to the Giants, but it wouldn't surprise me if Mekhi Becton starts shooting up some draft boards. Athletic, but the power. He just abuses guys out there on the edge, especially in the running game. When you look at him, you think Trent Brown and some of the dominance that guy can have as well. I think Becton's going to end up being a first rounder when it's all said and done. Sadiq Charles out of LSU, 6'4", 295 pounds. The junior, he's a little raw, has some skills though. I thought he should have come back for one more season. But one of the things that I really saw from him, especially in the national title game, was his ability to take those ends. Even when they had him beat, when they got to the edge, he was able to turn and drive that guy down the football field. When you get him away from the pocket like that, and he was bending at the waist and really kind of lunging, but he really did a good job actually driving him down the field. That allowed Joe Burrow to step up, keep his eyes down the field and make plays, find his receivers, found Chase and Marshall and Jefferson and Moss and Edwards-Helaire. Sadiq Charles, to me, he could be a third rounder, third, fourth round range. Feels about right now. Ezra Cleveland out of Boise State, very athletic tackle, 6'6", 310 pounds, very light on his feet. He's one of those guys, very effortless. He's a knee bender, bends very well. He's a finesse guy, though. He's one of those guys, he has excellent feet. He's going to stay in front of his man, but don't expect him to, I saw him make a couple of nice kick-out blocks in the bowl game and sustain some of his blocks, but you're not going to see him generate a whole lot of movement. And I wanted to see him get more strength, more core strength, more lower body strength. And I think that's really what he's lacking. So I think he's going to end up falling in the draft because of that. But he's a guy who I think has high upside because of his athleticism. Austin Jackson of USC, 6'6", 310 pounds. Didn't really give up a whole lot of hurries until he faced AJ Epinesa in the Holiday Bowl. And, I think for Austin Jackson, he lacks some polish, but he has tremendous length, very good athlete. One of those guys who I think when, the hands and the feet all matched and were all in sync, he did a really good job. I thought, there were 4 or 5 rushes where Epinesa really, just took it to him. But, there were a lot of reps where, he beat him to the edge with his kick slide, took really good angles. The hands, firing those hands off into the chest of Epinesa, really beating him to the punch there, getting it into the chest plate. I don't think Austin Jackson sustains his blocks very well. That's one of the things when USC was really struggling to run the football. They tried to run it behind Austin Jackson, wasn't sustaining blocks. So I think he needs to work on some of his strength as well. But the athleticism, a lot of people have him in the first round. I think he's going to be a second rounder. Andrew Thomas, 6'5", 320 pounds, the junior out of Georgia. This is a guy who I think can be a punisher there in the running game. Very, he's perfectly happy mauling you on the outside. And then, in pass blocking, has good feet. I think he's still developing a little bit as a pass blocker. But, you see him, I think there are times where he gets out in front of his toes a little bit, but very good power in his hands. The punch, that initial punch there, really keeps those, very, very tight and right into the chest plate, keeps them inside. And then the mirror skills. I think that's one of the things that you definitely see with Andrew Thomas. Very good feet. To me, I think Andrew Thomas isn't going to get past the Browns. Possibly the Jets at 11, but I think, the Browns at 10, that's probably the furthest we'll see Andrew Thomas get. I've got Jedrick Wills going to the Giants already in my first mock draft. Look, 6'5", 320 pounds out of Alabama. Best pass blocker in this draft, I believe. Some people are really starting to fall in love with Josh Jones, but look, Jedrick Wills, I thought, he took tremendous angles. I thought that, the kick slide looked effortless. His ability to mirror guys, the counter moves, able to wall those off. He anchors very well against the bull rush. When he did get a little off balance, he was able to reset his feet and re-anchor. A guy who just does a really good job redirecting those pass rushers and getting him away from the pocket. And then in the ground game, he generates a lot of movement, has tremendous power there at the right tackle position. And look, the Giants, if they're sticking with Nate Solder on the left side, Mike Remmers is going to be gone. Pencil Jedrick Wills in, and I think he can end up being a Pro Bowl right tackle. Isaiah Wilson, look, he was the right tackle to Andrew Thomas's left tackle, 6'7", 340 pounds there at Georgia, and one of those guys who I think continued to get better and better in his time at Georgia. Long arms, another big offensive tackle, just like Mekhi Becton. He's going to end up being a second rounder. He's one of those guys who I thought continued to get better week in and week out. A guy who's just going to punish you. Showed some decent lateral quickness. He struggled with some speed rushers, but that's to be expected for a guy his size. But one of those developing prospects. I look at the second round. I think that's probably where Wilson's going to come off the board. And then Tristan Wirfs. I think this is a guy who could be a perfect fit there for the Jets. 6'5", 322 pounds out of Iowa. A guy who, the power obviously jumps off the film, set the record there for the power clean, broke Brandon Sheriff's record. Brandon Sheriff ended up moving to guard and was a Pro Bowl guard for the Redskins this past season. I wouldn't be surprised if Tristan Wirfs ends up kicking inside, but he has too much athleticism to me. I think at the end of the day, he can play left tackle in a pinch, filled in for Alaric Jackson, but I think the right side is ultimately going to be where Tristan Wirfs is going to live. Has really good feet, the power step to the inside to wall off an inside rush, good mirror skills as well. Very physical as a run blocker. I think that's really where he's a little bit better. I think when you talk about Andrew Thomas, probably the best run blocker of the trio. Jedrick Wills, the better pass blocker. I think Tristan Wirfs has a little, probably the best combo of the two. So it'll be interesting to see how they all shake out. It could be Wills, Wirfs, Thomas. Wills, Thomas, Wirfs. I just think that Jedrick Wills, especially blocking for Daniel Jones and his physicality in the running game, blocking for Saquon Barkley, it's a match made in heaven for Dave Gettleman there at number 4 overall. Only 2 guards taken in the underclassmen declaring. When you look at the guard position, just 12 guards taken in this last draft. But we did have Chris Lindstrom taken in the first round, 3 guards taken in the third. Michael Dieter, Nate Davis, and Connor McGovern. Nate Davis really playing well there for the Tennessee Titans. Year before that, just 9 guards taken in 2018. That was the year of Quentin Nelson. Isaiah Wynn was taken. Will Hernandez. Braden Smith, all guys that got quite a bit of playing time. And you look at this year's class of underclassmen, you have Solomon Kindley, the big physical Georgia Bulldog, 6'4", 335-pound junior, a mauler in the middle, a guy who's going to get physical, road grader type. Struggles with speed, especially on the inside, those interior pass rushers he's going to struggle with. And then you have Netane Muti. Out of Fresno State. Now, Muti, he's 6'3", 307, the junior. He's another one of those mauler types. If you're trying to find the next Quentin Nelson, it's really hard to find the next Quentin Nelson, but a Quentin Nelson type, a guy who's going to be physical, who's going to maul, who's going to punish you on the inside. It's Muti. The problem is Muti, in every single one of his years there with the Bulldogs, his season was cut short due to injury. And can he stay healthy? Can he stay on the field? What are the medicals going to check out for him? He got injured at the beginning of the season, had to sit out the entire season. Battled some ACL, an ACL tear. I really worry about him from a durability standpoint. But when he's on the field, he's one of the better tacticians in this year's draft. Technicians, and he's someone who can end up being a day 2 pick. I just worry about the durability. Centers, 6 centers declared. So we have 5 that were taken in all of 2019. Garrett Bradbury, Elton Jenkins, Eric McCoy, guys that all started, Lamont Gilliard and Javon Patterson also taken late on day 3. A year before that, though, we had 11 centers taken in the draft. And when you look at the draft class with this, obviously, it kind of took a little bit of a hit when Creed Humphrey decided that he was going to come back to OU. But, I think these 6 centers could be among the top ranked centers in this year's draft. I think when you're talking about the seniors, Nick Harris of Washington, Darrell Williams of Mississippi State, Jake Hansen of Oregon are really your top 3 senior centers. So, and when you sprinkle these other guys in, Tyler Biadasz of Wisconsin, 6'3", 316-pound junior, started, I believe, every game at Wisconsin since his freshman year, been that constant there for Jonathan Taylor. 3 offensive linemen were drafted in this last year's draft, and they had to bring in 3 new starters. Cole Van Landen was kind of a spot starter there at left tackle. Tyler Biadasz still was able to help Jonathan Taylor get to that 2,000-yard mark. A very intelligent player. I think he's limited athletically, although you do see him get out and pull. Does a really good job staying under control, locating the linebacker or the DB at the second level. Struggles a little bit with some speed. But I think excellent hand placement, anchors pretty well. I think Biadasz, he has a good chance to be the number 1 center taken. I think Lloyd Cushenberry of LSU is going to push him, 6'4", 315 pounds, shows really good length at the Senior Bowl. Javon Kinlaw, the defensive tackle out of South Carolina, was dominant. Nobody could really stop him, with the exception of Lloyd Cushenberry. He was able to stifle him on 1 rep. And, I think that's really opened some eyes. His ability to really drop his weight, sink his hips, and get into his block. Uses those long arms effectively, gets into the chest plate, generates some movement in the running game. I think Lloyd Cushenberry, Tyler Biadasz really battling for that number 1 center. Matt Hennessy out of Temple, 6'4", 295, probably the best pass blocking center of the bunch. Pro Football Focus, I think as a sophomore, pressures on just, I think it was 0.7% of his pass rush snaps. Very good athlete, light on his feet. He'll be one of those centers, probably the number 3 center, and off the board. I look at Cesar Ruiz, a guy who is another really good athlete there from Michigan, 6'4", 320 pounds. He could be the 3rd or 4th center off the board, probably a 3rd-round pick when it's all said and done. Keith Ishmael, San Diego State, 6'3", 310 pounds, can play center. I think he can probably even kick over to guard a little bit. I thought he was a mainstay on that line for the Aztecs. He's somebody who I think is going to be a mid-day 3 pick. And then Tristan Colon Castillo, 6'4", 315 pounds out of Missouri. I think he can play both guard and center. Good length out of him. I think he'll end up being a day 3 pick. I do think he's going to get drafted because of that versatility. Cushenberry, Hennessy, and Ishmael all have their degrees, decided that they were going to go ahead and enter the draft. I think these 6 underclassmen, it's a really good center underclassmen draft. I think all of these guys could very well end up getting drafted when it's all said and done. So that's the offensive side of the football there with our underclassmen. We're at about an hour and a half in to this podcast. We're going to go ahead. I'm going to try to get all of this cranked out in 2 hours. If not, we'll go ahead and continue the rest of our underclassmen into the next podcast. I hate to do that, but we're running out of time, so I want to make sure that we cut things off at the 2-hour mark. I could talk about this for hours and hours, but I want to make sure that we have no more than 2 hours of content here on any given podcast. So the defensive end position, we have 10 defensive ends that were taken. That's cleared for the draft. When we look at the defensive end position, we had 30 defensive ends taken in 2019. The year before that, we had 22 taken. We look at the draft class this year, and I think there's a mix of seniors and juniors. But I've got my top 5 are all juniors. And then after that, we have a bunch of seniors, although I think Marlon Davidson really making a push to crack into that top 5, push for a potential first-round selection. So Olawale Batiku, Earned his degree at USC, transferred to Illinois as a grad transfer, 6'3", 250 pounds, battled injuries at USC, didn't really see much time on the football field, sat out 2018, went to Illinois in 2019, and really, the biggest thing was he was leading the nation in sacks, had 6 or 7 sacks to start out the year, and then struggled with his production as he got into Big Ten play. 9 sacks on the year, 13 tackles for loss. Explosive guy, struggles to get off blocks a little bit. He's one of those tweeners, 6'3", 250, probably going to be asked to play linebacker. Was a linebacker at USC. So it'll be interesting to see where he lines up. I think he's a day 3 guy all day long. Nick Coe out of Auburn, 6'5", 291 pounds, really looks like a 5 technique at the next level. Really had a breakout 2018, 13 and a half tackles for loss, 7 sacks. Just couldn't really find his way onto the field in 2019. Battled some injuries as well. Just 3 tackles for loss, no sacks in 2019. I think Nick Coe, it would have behooved him to come back for one more year. I thought that he really was outshined by Davidson, by Brown, and the fact that he wasn't able to beat out Big Cat Bryant for the other defensive end position, I think says a lot about where he was with that program. I think he's really going to have to work hard to be more than a late day 3 pick at this point. AJ Epinesa out of Iowa, look, 6'5", 280 pounds, one of the top rated prospects coming into Iowa. As a freshman, 5.5 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks. 2018, he was the guy that gave up that Max Sharping gave up his only sack to. Really got a good explosive burst off the edge. 16.5 tackles for loss, 10.5 sacks in 2018, and he was the Big Ten leader in sacks, even though. What's crazy is, even though he wasn't even the starter, he sat behind Anthony Nelson and Parker Hesse and still was able to put up double-digit sacks. And then you look at this past season, off to a slow start, but really when the bright lights were on, he really delivered. 14 tackles for loss, 11.5 sacks, and he has 9 forced fumbles in his career. He showed it off against USC, beat Austin Jackson like a drum coming off the edge. And what he does is, as he's turning that corner and he's getting to the quarterback, he's taking that outside arm and chopping down on the quarterback's arm before he's able to release the football. Really a knack for that. He's not your explosive rush end. That's Chase Young. But what you are going to see out of him, you're going to see tremendous length. You're going to see tremendous power and tremendous technique. Uses his hands very well. Does a really good job flattening out as well. He's not one of those guys who's going to take a long time to turn the corner. He's going to flatten out and get to the quarterback in a hurry. AJ Epinesa, to me, he's not getting past the top half of the first round. May slide a little bit depending on what he runs at the combine, but look, AJ Epinesa is a ball player, man. He's going to be one of those guys that teams are going to be looking for. Jonathan Garvin, Miami, 6'4", 250 pounds, the junior, 29 tackles for loss, 13 sacks in his 3 years there with the Hurricanes. One of those guys, I thought he had some athleticism coming off the edge. I think he's a day 3 guy, probably a late day 3 guy, but he's one of those guys, if he can show that he's, the athleticism in his workouts, he can get drafted. But I think it's going to be tough for him at the end of the day to be to solidify himself as a draft pick. He'll be one of those guys, kind of biting his nails a little bit as he goes through day 3 on the draft. Yetur Gross-Matos, 6'5", 264 out of Penn State. Look, the junior really broke out in 2018 as a sophomore. 20 tackles for loss, 8 sacks. This past season, another 14.5 tackles for loss and 9 sacks. So, he's one of those guys who I think has a really good burst coming off the edge, tremendous athleticism, tremendous length. He uses those long arms to his advantage, really beats that offensive lineman to the punch, if you will, with the extension of his arms, allows him to keep off of the tackle, or keep the tackle's arms off of him, and then able to rip through and turn the corner and flatten out to the quarterback. I thought that he was in the backfield a ton and really could have had more sacks. He's one of those guys who I think is still developing as a pass rusher, which is scary considering he does have 18.5 in his career for the Nittany Lions. Guy to keep an eye out for. He'll be a first rounder for sure. Elorm Lumor out of Rutgers. I think I'm pronouncing that right. 6'3", 248. I think he'll end up being a linebacker when teams are looking at him. The junior, 12.5 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks. He's the guy who earned his degree, decided he wanted to go ahead and enter the draft. And, he's an athlete. He's a project. I think he'll end up being a free agent. Teams may stash him away on their practice squad as a developmental guy, but I think that's probably the ceiling for him right now. James Lynch, Baylor, 6'4", 295 pounds. Man, 33 tackles for loss in his career, 20 sacks, 19.5 tackles for loss, and 13.5 sacks in 2019. This is a guy, at 6'4", 290, 295 pounds. He bends around the edge really well for his size. It's uncanny what he's able to do. You don't really expect a guy his size to bend like that. I thought he was one of those guys, in Big 12 play, teams really struggled to block him. I thought Georgia kind of figured both him and Bravion Roy out a little bit, which is a bit concerning. But when you talk about James Lynch, one of the name that really popped to my mind though was J.J. Watt. No, I'm not saying he's the next J.J. Watt or anything like that, but there are some similarities in their ability to bend at that size. Now, J.J. Watt, 6'5", 288 pounds. You look at him, similar body type, and what I want to see, because you see J.J. Watt doing a lot of those drills and being able to bend and turn the corner. What I'd really love to see is, and J.J. Watt, just pulling up his stats just to give you an idea of where he was at Wisconsin. But let's see. So finished with 36.5 tackles for loss and 11.5 sacks in those 2 seasons with Wisconsin. And then when he went to the combine, this is going to be the big question for Lynch. JJ had 34-inch arms, 11 and an eighth inch hand size, ran a 4.8 440 with a 1.64 10-yard split. 6.883 cone drill, so insane ability to bend, 37-inch vertical leap, 34 reps in the bench press. James Lynch is going to have his work cut out for him, but if he can put up numbers that are anywhere close to that, you're talking about a guy who can end up, rising up draft boards really quickly. I've got some, my dogs are playing in the background, so got to keep the peace back here for a moment. Let's see. Houston Miller out of Texas Tech, 6'4", 275, earned his degree. This is a guy, played in just 3 games for the Red Raiders, didn't see much time out on the field, decided that he'd go ahead and throw his name into the hat and work out for the draft. Curtis Weaver, Boise State, 6'3", 265, 47.5 tackles for loss, 34 sacks. Was just a half a sack shy in a sophomore season of having 3 straight years of double-digit sacks. The thing with Weaver is he a tremendous athlete? That's one of the things that you worry about. I look at him and I see a similar body type to Derek Barnett. I don't know that he necessarily has the power that Derek Barnett had with his hands. I thought Derek Barnett did a better job against the run, but I broke that down a little bit in a previous podcast. And I think that there are some similarities there between Curtis Weaver and Derek Barnett. I think Curtis Weaver ultimately is going to be in the top 20, top 25 picks, and is one of the better pass rushers in this draft. Which leads us to the game wrecker, Chase Young, 6'5", 265, out of Ohio State, the junior. Look, 40.5 tackles for loss, 30.5 sacks. This past season led the nation in sacks with 16.5, 21 tackles for loss, 4th in the Heisman. That's the highest that we've had from a defensive player in quite some time. And look, Chase Young, just a special player. I thought, he has better explosiveness than Joey Bosa and Nick Bosa before him. The physicality, his hands. He's one of those guys who's going to punish some offensive linemen. And then he has the speed to come off the edge and just wreak havoc in opposing backfields. If you try to overset against him, he's going to be too smart for that. He's going to go ahead and take that inside rush, cross the face of the offensive lineman and shoot into the backfield and try to take the head off of your quarterback. A guy who had 7 tackles for loss this year. 7 forced fumbles this year, 9 in his career. Knows what to do when he arrives at the football. Also had 8 pass breakups in his career as well. A guy who's looking for those strip sacks. He's not just looking to bring you down and take the quarterback down. He's looking to make a big play, a game-changing performance. And when you're talking about guys that you're going to take in the top 5, you have to know where they are at all times. And Chase Young, anybody that played against him had to know where he was on the field at all times. Chase Young, to me, no-brainer for Washington. At number 2, Ron Rivera gets a pass rusher that he can team with Ryan Kerrigan and Montez Sweat. Really going to make things a lot of fun there for the Redskins. If I'm Daniel Jones or Dak Prescott or Carson Wentz, I get a little nervous, thinking about the prospects of having to deal with that line, especially with Ron Rivera coming in as head coach. Defensive tackles. We only had 3 defensive tackles declare for the draft. When we look at defensive tackles, we had 20 defensive tackles drafted in 2019. When we look at this year's draft class, obviously you have Derek Brown and Javon Kinlaw there at the top. Neville Gallimore, another guy who is really showing up well at the Senior Bowl, a guy who is just really explosive. Let him be a guy who can, he played in an odd man set. If he could end up lining in an even man set, you're going to see a guy who uses some of that speed coming off the ball, getting into backfields in a hurry. But you look at these 3 guys that are coming out, and they're guys that are all going to be in my top 10. And the first one is Ross Blacklock, 6'4", 305, a guy who, 15 and a half tackles for loss in just 2 seasons there at TCU, 5.5 sacks as well. This is a twitched up dude, a guy who has really good athleticism. It bends really well. That's what's really crazy. He's going to get off blocks in a hurry. He's going to shoot gaps. And, if the quarterback's flushed out of the pocket, he's going to be able to put his foot in the ground. And the ankle flexion, you're going to see a guy who can plant and turn and move. He bends really well. I honestly think that Ross Blacklock's going to be a 2nd-round pick. And he's going to be one of those guys that we're talking about as one of those sleepers when it's all said and done. Jordan Elliott out of Missouri, 6'4", 315 pounds. I think Pro Football Focus has him rated as one of the top defensive tackles. He was known for his 3-sack game as a sophomore, 8.5 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks this past season. A guy who has tremendous length. I think another guy who has really good quickness off the ball. The speed to power is something that you're going to see. I think you're looking at a consistency more than anything else out of Jordan Elliott. And then Justin Matabuke, 6'4", 304, Texas A&M. Very physical at the point of attack. A guy who has tremendous upper body strength. A guy who's going to try to bench press you. I don't think he's as quick, but a guy, again, that physicality at the point of attack. He's going to muscle you. He's going to throw you off. He's going to get off blocks. 24.5 tackles for loss, 11 sacks. A guy who has short area burst to get to the quarterback as well. When I look at Matabuke, I think of disruptiveness. I think he's going to be a top 5 tackle in this year's draft. Not quite on the level of Derek Brown and Javon Kinlaw, but I think he's going to battle Blacklock, Gallimore as those next tackles off the board. So we move off the interior of that defensive line. We're going to take a look at linebackers. And outside linebackers, we have just 6 entering the draft. Marcus Brown at Missouri Western, 6'1", 220 pounds. Let's see. In 2018 for Missouri Western, those were the only numbers that I can find for him. It was through 2018. Total of 34 tackles and 1.5 sacks. Don't really know a whole lot about him. He looks like an undersized outside linebacker. Kalavan Chason, 6'4", 250 pounds out of LSU. Look, 13.5 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks this past season, go along with 60 tackles. A guy who is really explosive off the edge. He generates a lot more power coming off the edge than I really was expecting. A guy who uses his length, gets underneath the pad level, and is going to generate some power to drive his man back into the backfield. Also bends really well coming off the edge. One of the issues that he has is he loses contain a lot because he's one of those guys who is a one-track, mind getting after the quarterback when he's rushing. Showed an ability to drop a little bit in the college football playoff, which I thought was a breath of fresh air there for him. So I think things are going to be interesting when we're talking about Chason. I think he has the ability to be a first rounder, just not really sure exactly where he's going to go. Terrell Lewis out of Alabama, 6'5", 252 pounds. Lewis already earned his degree. And, in 2 seasons there at Alabama, 13 and a half tackles for loss, 11 and a half of those this past season, 6 sacks in 2019. And he was one of those pass rushers that everyone was expecting to see on the field for Bama in 2018, ended up having a season-ending injury, came back in 2019, and he's still one of those raw pass rushers. Hasn't really figured everything out, doesn't have an array of pass rush moves, just a guy who's going to get explosive, going to try to find ways to get to the passer, whether it's coming off the edge or taking an inside rush. You're not going to see a ton of finesse moves to him. He's one of those guys, not a ton of counter moves, but just that athleticism and his ability to get to the quarterback. I think he's going to be a situational pass rusher, continue to develop. He's a really good athlete, a guy who can make plays in the backfield. I think because of his athleticism and that potential, he'll be a second-round pick. Kenneth Murray out of Oklahoma, 6'2", 234. The junior, one of the more athletic linebackers you're going to find in this year's draft. You look at this guy, and he looks like he's chiseled out of rock. And a guy who just has that sideline-to-sideline speed, had 155 tackles in 2018, had over 30 tackles, I want to say, against Army in their overtime win. 12 and a half tackles for loss and 4.5 sacks that season. Came back with another 100 tackle performance in 2019, 17 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, another 4 pass breakups. To me, he struggled with gap integrity against the run when he was lined up on the at inside linebacker. I think really for him, you put Kenneth Murray on the outside. That's really when he shined, when he was allowed to just fly around to the football and make plays. That was when Caleb Kelly came back and played on the inside. That allowed freed Kenneth Murray up to really be that athlete out on the outside. And if you allow him to just run and make plays, he's going to make plays all over the field. If he's not actually asked to, the gap assignments, that's really what seemed to struggle, especially in his first 2 seasons. You didn't see it quite as much with Alex Grinch's defense, but still something that I think he was out of position a lot, in those running plays. And that's where Oklahoma got gouged quite a bit up the middle. You allow him to play him in space. You allow him to run around to the football, and I think you're going to have something there. I think Kenneth Murray has the athleticism and the playmaking ability to be a first rounder, but only if you end up playing him on the outside. Which leads us to this year's Swiss Army knife, Isaiah Simmons. Looks like, he started as a safety. He's 6'4", 230 pounds now. Has played safety, has played the nickel, he's played linebacker, both inside and outside. He's been a rush defensive end. He plays everywhere. 104 tackles this past season, 16 and a half tackles for loss, 8 sacks, 3 interceptions, 8 pass breakups, 2 forced fumbles, and a partridge in a pear tree. This guy, just a freak of nature. He has the safety ability. He was playing deep safety, showed excellent range coming over the top. Very decisive, gets a good break on the football, easy interceptions getting over to the sideline. I thought what was really impressive was he covered Shi Smith, the slot receiver there for South Carolina, got underneath that route, recovered really well, leaping to knock the football away. I think Isaiah Simmons, he can rush the passer, times his blitzes really well. I think that's one of the things that as a linebacker, some of those delayed blitzes, knows when to take off. If you've got a lineman who's got to end up blocking, one of 2 guys, he's going to make sure that that tackle picks up the other defender before he takes off and gets into the backfield after the quarterback. But he's also adept against the run. Does a good job setting the edge, forcing the run plays back to the inside. But he's so explosive coming off the edge. Bends really well coming around the corner, the ankle flexion. You really see him, the flexibility, the core strength as well. fighting through the blocks, coming downhill and making plays behind the line of scrimmage. He's a special talent, top 10 guy. I think Carolina could use him. I think Jacksonville can use him as well. He's not getting out of the top 10. Here's one place that you could potentially consider him. How about the Giants? Giants need a playmaker on the back end of their defense. Isaiah Simmons could end up being that guy. Josh Uche out of Michigan, 6'2", 250 pounds. Look, 10.5 tackles for loss, 7 sacks. Had at least 7 sacks in each of the last 2 seasons. A pass rusher extraordinaire coming off the edge. But Senior Bowl, I haven't gotten to watch too much of the film, but what I was reading online, I want to say it was DraftWire, was really talking and hyping up, might have been Draft Network, really hyping up Josh Uche and his ability to cover, showing off really good athleticism. Really want to see him work at the combine, want to see some of that. He wasn't asked to do that a ton at Michigan, but he's a tremendous athlete, can play in space, and I think that's just going to improve his draft stock, could end up being a second rounder when it's all said and done, especially if he's the guy that can get after the quarterback. Inside backers, just have 4 inside linebackers taken. Willie Gay out of Mississippi State, 6'2", 240 pounds, the junior. Played in just 5 games this past season. He was one of those guys who got suspended. I think there was a tutor in a chemistry class that ultimately ended up taking lab assignments and taking tests for them. And so he only played in 5 games. But he was a difference maker. You saw that in the bowl game. He had 11 tackles in that bowl game, a guy who plays sideline to sideline, the excellent range, really an intelligent player. But obviously you're going to have to question things with his, with the character a little bit. I think that's definitely a red flag. I'm going to have to talk to the to coaches a little bit, maybe a day 3 pick. But I also wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't get drafted. 2 LSU Tiger inside linebackers, Jacob Phillips and Patrick Queen. Now, Jacob Phillips was the guy that everyone was talking about, 6'4", 233 pounds, over 100 tackles, led the Tigers in tackles, 7.5 tackles for loss. And he's one of those guys I think plays really well laterally. You talk about a lot of guys that can get downhill and are those downhill thumpers, but guys that struggle moving laterally. I think Phillips is a more natural athlete than a lot of inside linebackers, a guy who can play sideline to sideline, can slide over from hole to hole to plug up the run plays. I think he's someone who is going to be drafted in the first 3 rounds, based on his athleticism. And then there's Patrick Queen, 6'1", 227 pounds. Again, we talked about Jacob Phillips, but it was Patrick Queen. Every time he put on game film against LSU games, every time I was watching, he was the guy that was making plays. He was the one that was coming over, sideline to sideline range, guy that was being disruptive in the backfield, had 12 tackles for loss, also had 85 tackles on the year, picked off a pass, couple of pass breakups, disruptive behind the line of scrimmage, a guy who, playing over the top as well. He's one of those linebackers who I think is going to continue to play hard. He's really, kind of building off of the defensive MVP performance in the national championship game. A guy who I think is ascending. I don't know that he's going to be a first rounder. There's a possibility, but I think he'll definitely be an early second round pick when it's all said and done. At the latest. David Woodward out of Utah State, 6'2", 230 pounds. Played in 7 games as a freshman, 7 games as a junior. Battled some injuries there. But when he was healthy, guy played all over the field. I thought a little stiff in coverage at times, but he did have, 12.5 tackles for loss, 5 sacks to go with 134 tackles in his sophomore season. Tremendous instincts, a guy who was a volume tackler in just 7 games, had 93 tackles, 5 going for loss, 2 sacks, a couple of pass breakups, 4 forced fumbles, guy who has a knack for going after the football, making plays. I look at David Woodward. He's one of those inside backers who, I think he'll probably be in the 4th to 5th round range, but I wouldn't be surprised. You think of Nick Vigil, another Utah State Aggie, he's one of those guys who's still in the league and still making plays. And he ended up coming off the board right around in that range, and I could absolutely see David Woodward being the same type of player. So I think when we're looking at time, we're pretty much up on time. So for those of you who are tuning in, hoping to listen to the secondary picks, we're going to have to push that to next week. So that'll actually be kind of the teaser there, something to look forward to. We're obviously going to also be talking about all of our postseason games, the bowl games and the all-star games. We'll start off with the secondary. We'll talk about the corners. We have 15 corners. And then at the safety position, another 9 safeties on top of that. So we've got 24 players that we're going to cover before we jump into the postseason games after that. But we got through the majority of the 115 players in the 2 hours. In fact, let's see. That's 93 of the 115 players that we were able to get through in the 2 hours. That's not too bad in terms of the overall time frame. So you'll have to tune in next week to talk about Jeffrey Okudah, Christian Fulton, Grant Delpit, and Xavier McKinney and company. I think it's a really deep draft at the corner position, and I think there's some safeties that we're going to talk about as well. So I'm really looking forward to the draft process. This is really where things get ramped up, and I'm really excited for it. I hope you are as well. It's time to really get you ready for the draft. We're under 100 days from the draft in April in Las Vegas, Nevada, right in front of those Bellagio fountains. I mean, what's more iconic than those fountains there in Vegas? I mean, you think about, Ocean's 11, that last scene when they're all standing there in front of those fountains. I mean, that's one of the things that really comes to mind when I think of those fountains. So it's going to be fun. I think over these next couple of months, we'll talk about some of my mock drafts. We're going to get into the combine, what to expect leading into the combine, who has the most to gain, the most to lose. Some of the guys under the radar, guys to keep an eye out for. After the combine, we'll start breaking down positions. We're going to take a look at free agency, what the top needs are going to be, who are going to be the best fits for the different programs, and then all of that will lead up to April 23rd. So I'm looking forward to it. I hope you are as well. I hope everyone had a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I know we're towards the end of January already. Hopefully everyone enjoyed Martin Luther King Day. I know I did. And man, we're almost into February. It's hard to believe it's almost February, but 2020 already off to a fast start. But I hope everyone enjoys their weekend. We'll do this all again next week. Come back, shall you? Shall we? I guess is how we should say it. But anyway, for readyforthedraft.com, this has been the Ready for the Draft podcast, getting you ready for the NFL draft. I've been your host, Gregg Schutze. I hope you've enjoyed listening as much as I've enjoyed bringing this to you. We'll do it all again next week. Until then, take care, everyone, and I am out of here.